Wells Fargo recently made a $1 billion commitment for our national philanthropy to help individuals and families obtain safe and affordable housing. And we look forward to working together to help communities throughout Los Angeles and across the country develop access to these important resources. But today it's my honor to introduce Jason Elliott, Chief Deputy Cabinet Secretary for Governor Gavin Newsom. Jason has extensive experience in public policy and advises the governor on numerous issues affecting the state of California. Among them, Jason has provided strategic guidance to the governor on the recent landmark agreement between California and 4 of the world's largest automakers to cut emissions and preserve California's environmental leadership. Jason has deep experience in solving urban issues, serving the city of San Francisco in various roles, culminating in his service as Chief of Staff for 3 San Francisco mayors during a period of immense transition. We look forward to Jason informing us about the governor's priorities and homelessness. So with that, please welcome Jason Elliott.
The governor's approach on both housing and homelessness is about investment and accountability. We are investing, and we will continue to invest record amounts of money in housing and homelessness. And with that investment, we ask for accountability, and we demand accountability. Let's start with homelessness. The budget that was passed this year by the legislature included $1 billion in aid for homelessness, $650 million of which direct to the cities and counties in the continuums of care for emergency solutions. Another $120 million for the Whole Person Care Program, for those of you who are familiar with that. I wrote down here, of that $650 million, we're still doing a little bit of tweaking in math, but the LA City, County, and the Continuum of Care is due for north of $310 million of that $1 billion. So we're talking about pretty significant investment in resources in this problem. The governor convened a task force of regional homeless advisors. I know you're going to hear from some of them, I think, after me. So with appreciation to Mayor Steinberg, to Mr. Supervisor Ridley Thomas, also Mayor Schaaf is on that task force, and then I know Mayor Garcetti is going to be participating as well. I imagine that our task force co-chairs have talked quite a bit about a right to a roof, a right to housing. I'm going to listen to that panel, as you are, and continue to hear that discussion and hear the arguments around that idea. So I'll defer on speaking to that directly today, but I do again want to say it's around investment and accountability. So with that investment, $650 million and more, total of $1 billion, we ask for regional plans. We ask for regions to get together and plan for solutions around homelessness. LA is actually pretty good at this. Not every place in the state is as coordinated as LA is, and I was reading through some of the materials on the plane down this morning about what voters in LA think about whether or not the region is doing a good job. I think by and large people are ready for success from the region here. It's not the case in a lot of places where cities aren't talking. Counties and cities are fighting. Mayor Steinberg has an aggressive agenda, and he's looking for help on that. So in a lot of places we need more regional collaboration. We use our investment to motivate that accountability again. We need immediate impacts from this $650 million investment. The money has not yet gone out the door, but it will soon. And when it does, it needs to have immediate impact. In other words, we're not looking to see that new state money replace spending that's already happening. We're looking for additive. And Mr. Ridley Thomas constantly reminds us about the fact that on average 3 homeless people lose their lives every day in LA alone. This is a crisis by any definition of that word, and it demands a crisis response. And that's what we're hoping to see with this $1 billion in new investment. Turns out President Trump has also taken interest in homelessness in California in recent days. We appreciate his attention to this matter. We hope that he will be constructive in his engagement with the state on how to solve homelessness. So, we have sent President Trump a letter. In government, this is what we do. We send each other letters. We sent President Trump a letter a while ago, signed by the governor, co-signed by CSAC, the League of Cities, and the Big 13 mayors, saying to the federal government, if you're serious about solving homelessness, provide us 50,000 housing vouchers right now. You can do it. HUD has those. You can reallocate those vouchers, and we can put those to work right away. That's both Section 8 housing choice vouchers, as well as HUD vouchers for veteran homelessness. if the federal, and we got a letter back from Secretary Carson saying thanks, but no thanks, basically. So we're going to continue to echo that call. And I would ask and urge everyone in this room to echo that with us, because we know that housing is the solution to homelessness. For all of the shelters that we will build, for all of the safe tent encampment locations that we will construct, the answer to this problem is housing. And we need the federal government to do their part. 50,000 more vouchers will make a meaningful difference in California, and the federal government can do that right now. So we will continue to beat that drum. When cities ask for solutions, we try to answer. And I want to also acknowledge Mr. Santiago, who put forward Assembly Bill 1197 this year. The governor was proud to sign that bill. Thank you. I take it by that reaction, I don't have to spend a lot of time explaining what that is, but basically it's a proof point in a larger theme that when cities or counties say this is what we need to address this crisis, they'll find a supportive ear in Governor Newsom. Again, that's a demonstration of that sort of ultimate state-local partnership. This isn't the local's fault or the state's fault or even the Fed's fault. At this point, we need to create partnership and stop blaming each other. And in 1197 and in some of the other work we're doing, you're starting to see those partnerships build, and we welcome those partnerships through whatever form they may take. And it looks one way in LA, and it looks a whole different way in Yolo County. So we're welcoming of those partnerships on homelessness. Turn our attention, in the time I have remaining, to the question of housing. Again, in the framework of investment and accountability. I'm in Southern California, so let me acknowledge, if anybody here is from Huntington Beach, one of the first actions that we took, if anyone here represents Huntington Beach, one of the first actions that we took when Governor Newsom, after he took the oath of office, was referring a lawsuit under our Housing Accountability Act powers against some actions the city of Huntington Beach had taken around housing approvals, or lack of zoning, more precisely. So let me acknowledge that that's an action we took. It led to a convening of a number of other cities, many of which, more than a dozen of which, have come into compliance with their housing element. So that was a meaningful step that we took, and it actually motivated action. We want to continue to pursue those powers when necessary. But for those who are in the housing space and following the news lately, there is a very troubling case in San Mateo that is playing out right now, where the question of whether the state can enforce Housing Accountability Act and other laws has really been called into question. We're very concerned about this case. This is timely today. We're very concerned about this case. We're in touch with the plaintiffs on that case. The state must preserve its ability to hold cities accountable through existing law. So we're, as I said, in touch with the plaintiffs in that case, and we will be engaging at the appropriate time and in the appropriate way. Again, this isn't about Southern California. I know one of the questions we got was, well, why did you just sue a Southern California city? And I think our point was we want to make progress, and it happened that Huntington Beach provided us with an opportunity to file that lawsuit and show that we were serious about this, and we continue to engage in dialogue with Huntington Beach on that question. Perhaps more timely for this group in this region is, of course, the question around the Southern California area government's RHNA numbers and the allocation and the discussion back and forth between SCAG and our HCD, and it's obviously resulted in a target of 1.3 million units for this region. ADUs are going to be one of our answers, and we were happy to sign a lot of bills on ADUs. I noticed that in the materials that LABC provided as well, as a huge opportunity without doing a ton of visual densification. So ADUs are definitely going to be a big part of that. RHNA, the way we see RHNA is that it's sort of the ultimate local control mechanism on housing. And I know that may be counterintuitive for those of you who are engaged in this space. But at the state, we set these big high-level targets. We allocate these targets to the areas of the COGS, and then they work with their cities to do sub-allocations, and ultimately that zoning and planning happens at the local level. And I know it may not feel this way, and perhaps there's an argument, a good argument to be had, that this, you could see it another way, but we see RHNA as ultimately embodying and enabling that local control, because it's local governments that choose where to zone and plan for that housing. But again, that's the accountability. We'll set those targets. We need to see cities zone and plan for their share, their legal share of the state's need to build more housing. So accountability, investment, $1,750 million in this budget this year for housing. A lot of that goes directly to the cities for technical assistance so they can improve their processes, so they can meet those RHNA targets. $500 million for infrastructure. Not so much LA's problem, but some of these littler cities and counties can't afford to build sewer systems to accommodate new housing. They just don't have the cash. We made money available for that. $1 billion for subsidy for low-income housing. First steps. These are first steps. We need to do more on housing. What the governor and the legislature did this year are first steps. But we need to see cities, again, especially some of the smaller cities, step up, do their zoning, access this money, and get permits turned so that we can get housing built. I'll begin to close by talking a bit about what's been in the news recently around tech company investments in housing. $4.5 billion that the governor worked with Apple, Facebook, and Google to secure. Those companies feel like they're up there in the Bay Area and not really relevant to LA. To Southern California. Well, I'm happy to say that as part of the discussion that we had with those technology companies, we said these investments need to be statewide investments. These are not dedicated exclusively to Northern California or to the Bay Area. And we didn't have to push very hard, frankly, because as you all know, those companies have a presence down here. And that was a very welcome message that those companies received. It's a philanthropy, but a lot of this also comes from the treasury side of these corporations, and it feels to perhaps their books like an investment, but it's an investment below market rate. So we're able to access capital, build more housing, catalyze more housing, and these companies can participate in a solution to housing affordability. So I just will maybe end my comments by saying, okay, not everybody's as big as Google maybe, but here's the thing. Every company in California has the ability to find a project in your hometown, in your neighborhood, and to invest in that project. That investment could certainly take the form of capital. That investment could also take the form of attention, mentorship, political participation, and accountability. So you could find a project, and I would actually encourage everyone who is affiliated with a corporation or a business in this room to consider this. Adopt a program, adopt a project in your community. It could be a homeless shelter. It could be a housing project. By turning your attention to it, you're going to hold your city council people and your members of your boards of supervisors accountable to see that project through and not let it get stuck up in process. You can provide assistance and mentorship to those who are trying to deliver housing and homelessness projects. And if you're able to, you can provide money to subsidize those projects. And I understand that's not a possibility for everyone, but for many of you it is. And so as a bit of a call to action, I would say consider whether you're a business affiliated group, whether you are yourself a corporation, whether you're an individual who wants to participate. Identify a project. It can be a small one, a medium-sized one, or a big one. Identify a project and get involved and get your company involved. Mentor that, adopt that project, and help see it through to the finish line, because we are not going to meet the millions of units we need unless we do all the little ones. The little ones add up to something big, and you all have a role to play in helping those little ones become bigger ones. So with that, I will close. Thank you very much for inviting me down today and for allowing me to share these thoughts.
Please now welcome LABC President Mary Leslie and Associate Faculty Director of the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, Dr. Michael Lenz.
Welcome everybody to UCLA. The UCLA Lewis Center is happy to partner with the LA Business Council and the LA Times on this poll and this work. And this represents one of several ongoing efforts at UCLA to respond to the homelessness crisis in our region. Scholars in fields at UCLA as diverse as business, law, public policy, economics, urban planning, psychiatry, and medicine, just to name a few, are engaged in research and policy advising on homelessness, and and at the Luskin School of Public Affairs in particular, we're studying eviction as a pathway into homelessness. We are active in the Homelessness Policy Research Institute, which is a collaborative effort between USC and UCLA. And also within the Luskin School's building, the California Policy Lab at UCLA is working on several projects focused on understanding the drivers and pathways into homelessness from a service provision and labor market perspective. Finally, and perhaps most urgently and importantly, Our students are doing incredible work on many levels, and I would specifically like to highlight the undergraduates that work at Bruin Shelter, where they operate a shelter for students experiencing homelessness across the Los Angeles region. This is all important work. We're very proud of it, but we know that we need to do much, much more. And we need to work harder on these issues and better coordinate what we already do, not only on our campus, but throughout the region with policymakers and influential people such as yourselves. This gathering today, I hope and we hope, is a particular step in that direction. Mary?
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, give him a round of applause. Have you been enjoying today? Has this been good? Thank all our speakers and panelists that came before. Well, thank you, Michael. And of course, we are thrilled to be here with UCLA again. This is our 18th year, you guys. So for those of you who have come before, thank you for hanging in there with us. It's our honor today to have had Jason Elliott with us. He is the person responsible for Governor Newsom for housing issues. And we are so lucky to have a governor with 20 years of experience in the housing area. He's going to be a real help and has already been to this region. LA's partnership is going to be critical. We need those state resources. We need them because they're critical to increasing the resources and removing the regulatory barriers that we have that are preventing us from solving our homelessness and affordability issues. Providing every Angelino with a dignified home is the #1 issue for the Los Angeles Business Council. I've been asked several times today by the media, why? And I think today is telling you why. Our members see this as their #1 issue. The LABC has supported education and advocacy around the affordability issues, of course, for a very long time. But I think in 2019, when we saw the loss of numbers a few months ago, things really changed for us. I think business as usual was not acceptable anymore. We couldn't get used to this level of homelessness as a new normal. So the LABC entered into a historic partnership, and we're really grateful to Norm Pearlstine, who's with us today, the editor of the LA Times. Give him a round of applause. And the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. Together, we collaborated on a public opinion research project focused on LA County residents to see how they felt about more taxes, laws, initiatives to combat the housing and homelessness crisis. The research was designed to measure residents' opinions on solutions being identified and their willingness to support those solutions in their own neighborhoods. Just last week, the poll results were released. I hope you all got a chance to read it. It ran for 3 days. If not, feel free to go to our website or the LA Times or UCLA, and it's all there for you. We made it completely open, transparent, and free to you, all this information. So, what do we find in this poll? Homelessness is the #1 concern of 95% of the people across the county. We have never seen a poll result like that before, and we've done polling before. That's more than traffic congestion, climate change, public safety, taxes, and jobs. For us at the LABC, there is no more important issue, humanitarian, health-related, and public policy challenge than this right now. We must restore the lives of 59,000 people. These are our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues that are living on the streets of LA County who need a home, need health care, need counseling, need job training. So we're going to do something else historic. Today, we have committed to support the vision of Supervisor Mark Ridley-Thomas and Darrell Steinberg. This is really about whether or not it's time to change the way we approach this issue statewide. Statewide, we have 90,000 homeless, and enact more of a legal imperative that people have rights. It's not voluntary, that you have a right to a bed, you have a right to a roof over your head. And coupled with the key supportive services people can re-enter, get their feet back on the ground, and have a pathway to the permanent homes that we have been committed to building. The poll also found that 75% of Angelenos support this right. It's fundamental. So we hope all of you can join with us. As Nadine Watt, our LABC chair, urged you this morning, please go to our website and let the governor and other elected officials know that you would like to see a legal right to a roof. Now, the best part of today. It's my pleasure to introduce the man at the helm of the LA Times who put the full resource of the Times behind this poll, Norm Pearlstine. Norm is the executive director of the LA Times, a post he's held since 2018. Under Norm's leadership, the LA Times has become an important leader on the issue of homelessness and housing affordability, pushing insightful stories, editorials, and expanding coverage as the challenges have snowballed. Many of our LABC members feel that last week, the LA Times coverage of the public opinion survey and related stories changed the conversation, and we certainly hope so. We are so appreciative to have Norm with us today, delivering a keynote, and indeed, we are so fortunate to have him serving as the executive editor of the LA Times. He is one of the nation's most prominent media leaders. Before taking the helm of the LA Times under the new publisher, Norm served as the chief content officer and then vice chairman of Time Inc., as well as its chief content officer at Bloomberg. Over his career, Norm has worked as a reporter and an editor at prominent outlets, including more than 2 decades at the Wall Street Journal, where he served as executive editor and in other top leadership positions. Norm also served as executive editor at Forbes magazine and has too many awards for me to be able to illuminate at this moment. However, it's in your program guide. So we are fortunate to have him with us here in Los Angeles. Please welcome Norm Pearlstine.
Well, thank you very much for letting me join you today at such an important conference on such an important subject. And we in the news business often say that we are much better selling advice than following it. And but this time, when Mary and Steve Sugarman came to me and said they wanted to do a poll on homelessness, we were excited to participate because we realized through months and months of coverage that we were no closer to coming up with answers than anyone else, and that part of the issue was that while reporting can give you a lot of anecdotal information, getting a real understanding of how our community feels about a subject as important as homelessness seemed like a very important place to start. So my thanks particularly to the Los Angeles Business Council Institute and to UCLA. We could not have had better partners. We were also blessed in having as our pollster Peter Hart, who was really one of the deans of American polling over the last several decades, who came out of retirement to do this poll and to lead a focus group that really gave a sense of understanding and of urgency about how people feel about this most important subject. We had done polls in 2006, 2007, where when Angelenos were asked what were the most important concerns they had, homelessness was barely recognized, even though there were certainly examples of homelessness at the time. But in this poll, we found that it is the most important issue for a very large part of the population. And I think as part of that, we also saw that there was, frankly, a great deal of frustration in knowing that a lot of money is being spent, knowing that voters had actually responded to the chance to tax themselves more because they thought the issue so important. And yet, even after a year where some 20,000 additional housing units were created for homeless people. In the county of Los Angeles, we saw a huge increase to the point where we now are looking at some 60,000 homeless people in the county. And that's a rather imprecise number because, as you can imagine, it's not the easiest group to poll. And so we were already doing a great deal of coverage, but the poll, in a way, was validated the sense of importance and also made us want to ask questions not only about our elected officials, but also about ourselves in terms of what kind of messaging we do as a publication. The Los Angeles Times has had a great tradition of local reporting where accountability has been a hallmark of our efforts, but I think we came out of this exercise understanding that recognizing success, recognizing people who are on the front lines making a difference, and recognizing the very hard work that is being done by people is really a first step toward coming up with solutions. It is very difficult to look at Los Angeles County today compared to where it was and try to understand the ways in which it is like the rest of the country and in the ways in which it is so different. We see 2020 as the most important election of our lifetime, and that in many ways California gives us a peculiar lens through which to look at national issues, because on almost every count you can point to California as being at odds with the current White House. And so on any issue, not just homelessness, but on issues of immigration, environment, health care, education, you see that California is a progressive state. Los Angeles is a progressive county. And so you have to ask yourself, when the legislature is so much of one party, why do we have the kinds of differences that we do? And some of it, I think, is structure. As you all know, and I have learned, covering 88 municipalities in Los Angeles County is almost as challenging as trying to govern it. And we find that we can have common themes and common categories that we can cover, but to actually get to know the people who are living with these kinds of issues every day is really quite a challenge. When I first worked here, this is my third time working in Los Angeles, although the first time that the Los Angeles Times was willing to hire me, and I thank Patrick Soonchong for that opportunity. But some of the things that I've noticed that I think have tremendous impact on dealing with these pressing social issues are, one, that for all of the vibrance of the county, for all of the things that make it so attractive, when I first came here, there was a corporate community of large corporations and institutions that were very much identified with civic issues. If you thought about energy, you had ARCO, you had OxyPeat, you had Union Oil. If you thought about banking, with Security Pacific, and B of A having a bigger operation here than in the Bay Area. If you think about defense, with Lockheed and Northrop and North American Rockwell, those large corporations have ended up going elsewhere. The entertainment community, of course, is our big industry, and it is a big export, but it has not identified with the city and county the way that banks and other kinds of large corporations have. What has happened in Los Angeles is a remarkable influx of of people from around the world who want to be here. We pride ourselves on having the most inclusive newsroom of any news organization that I know of, but we don't come close to representing the diversity and the variety of institutions and of people that make up Los Angeles County. You all know the statistics, but with 47% of the county being Hispanic, with close to 20% being Asian American, and with a large majority of people who are born here with English as a first language, nonetheless identifying themselves on the basis of that place of origin, it's a real challenge for us to be relevant to to these communities, and I think it is equally a challenge for our elected officials. And so when you think about homelessness, you have to recognize, I think, the variety of reasons for homelessness and the variety of reasons why it is so difficult to get out of a homeless condition once you find yourself falling into it. We are still trying to debate the questions of whether issues such as alcoholism or drug addiction precedes homelessness or is a result of becoming homeless, and the answer is that it's both. We are still trying to understand the role that mental health plays, and the fact that so many of the institutions that once were providing support have lost funding to do so. And I think that as we look forward, we just have to recognize that for all of the things that make Los Angeles the great city it is, the future of our country, the future of the Pacific Rim, I think it all comes here, but it all falls apart if we can't solve this most basic problem. And so that is one of the things where I look forward to hearing from our elected officials, and certainly look forward to hearing suggestions from all of you in ways that we can do a better job of serving you. Thank you very much.
Please now put your hands together for Emile Haddad, Chairman and CEO of 5 Point.
I was introduced as the CEO of 5 Point, but 34 years ago, when my family and I fled our war-torn country and came here with nothing, we could have easily been part of the statistic of homelessness at the time. We came with nothing, but I built on a foundation that allowed me to be here today. And this foundation of excellent education, family support, and absolute belief in the American dream. Today, I'm here to represent a company which was built in California. We are a pure California company, and we rise and fall with the state. We are partners with the cities and the counties that we build in, and our mission is to build fully integrated, diversified, multi-generation communities that provide equal access. Equal access to education, equal access to home ownership, equal access to healthcare, and equal access to recreation. Our communities today, if you were to go and see them, are a proof of concept. Because we, as a group of people who have been committed to this vision for over 2 decades, deeply believe that if we're going to create a sustainable society, we have to create a place where people of all walks of life can be together, where we can provide an ability for 3 generations of the same family to be in close proximity. We believe in building inclusive communities and not exclusive communities. So when we look today at this event and what is needed, we believe that this is a call to action for a partnership, for collaboration, because we believe that that's the only way we're going to be able to solve the immediate issue of homelessness and avoid future crises that is similar. History had taught us that we cannot solve issues in abstract. We have to break the silos. Every time we try to fix an issue, we created unintended consequences that created another. Over the last century, industrialization and flight to suburbia and the zoning codes that segregated uses, connecting them with an automobile, have created a lot of issues that we recognized and started dealing with. 3 decades ago, it became very clear to people that that was damaging the environment. And as we started going down a path of fixing that by slowing growth, we created today a housing crisis. And as we abandoned the urban core and went to suburbia and left people behind, we saw our public education system in the inner core deteriorate. And we all know what type of issues that caused. So today, I think we are all called to come together, public and private sectors, academic institutions, and NGOs. We all need to come together because that's the only way we're going to be able to avoid making mistakes of the past. We need courage, and we need true leadership. I can tell you that we are willing to do our part. The communities we build are a proof of concept. We are turning Navy bases into vibrant communities. We are breaking runways and turning them into green fields. We are building a city that's a net zero greenhouse city right here in LA County. Our partnership with our public school districts are allowing us to build state-of-the-art schools where people of every income, people who come from low income and kids of millionaires, are getting the same education. 70 languages are spoken at our school. We are creating 300,000 jobs for the state of California and contributing $54 billion to its economy. And we stand ready. And we are asking all of us to come together to solve the immediate issue at hand, one of the biggest problems that this state has. Because out there right now, there's an unfortunate person without shelter. And who knows, if we all come together, maybe that person one day will be standing right here, telling us all that the American dream is still well and alive. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Honorable Eric Garcetti, Mayor of Los Angeles.
Well, good afternoon, Los Angeles. How's everybody doing? Good. Well, I'm so excited to be back here on this great campus, even with the USC shirt back there. I like that. See, we come in peace. Everybody's together here. But all kidding aside, I'm going to cut to it. As we gather here today, the California dream is in peril. The California dream, just like the American dream, has always been a brave and a bold expression of the future. I'm just going to get rid of this, hold on. And at the heart of that dream has always been a vision of what the middle class is. Good weather, good jobs, good schools, and good housing. You've never had to be from California to understand what California stands for. And California, in the minds of most, has been this land of limitless opportunity, where explorers responded to the call to go west in these native lands and build a future, a horizontal place unburdened by high-rises, hierarchies, and histories. You didn't have to pay your dues or wait your time here. You just had to have a good idea. You had to be willing to work hard, and you could have this dream too. And it seemed in our history with each day as our dreams grew, so did our city and our state. In many ways, it's a unique dream in America. I was talking to a pollster recently who said, around this country, people dream in every state, but they only call it the California dream in California. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, a fourth-generation product of this great city. In the 1970s and 80s, when I was a little kid, the California dream was sun-drenched with optimism. I saw that dream up close. The economy was strong, the schools were good, and the housing was affordable and plentiful. Today, we're still blessed with good weather. Through our collective work, the state and our city is still filled with good jobs. Our education record is a little more mixed. While our higher education system, including this campus, is still the envy of America and we've made community college free, we've starved our K-12 education for too many decades. But the one thing of those four, between the weather, jobs, education, and a good place to live, where we have failed the most is with housing. It has changed the most dramatically in my lifetime, and it now is the prism through which we refract the promise and the peril of that California dream. That dream today has turned into fitless sleep or even a nightmare for too many of us. This is my 18th year with you here at LABC. I'm sure somebody in this room wasn't even born when I first came here. And I love coming here. First of all, because of all of you, the people that come to this summit. A unique collection of dreamers and doers, academics, builders, public officials and government folks from the public and private sector and nonprofits. But it's also a place where ideas are announced, where campaigns are launched, where we view our transportation and our sustainability through the lens of housing, and where we talk about policies by connecting the dots and connecting people. This LABC Summit is a place where we are unafraid to let our reach exceed our grasp, to dream bigger, to think boldly. At least that's what it's always been for me. A time for us to gather our thoughts, to commemorate our progress, and to honestly face where we have come up short and to announce how to move forward. Just look at our gathering since I became mayor. It was here that I came to you, and we came together to begin the campaign to launch Measure M, the largest transportation measure in American history ×2. It was here where we talked about lowering the city's business tax and raising its minimum wage. Here where we began the campaigns to pass the two largest homeless local government initiatives in American history. Here with this organization where we launched a solar feed-in tariff that's helped make Los Angeles the #1 solar city in America. There's one guy, there's my solar guy. And when I became your mayor, I said I was going to look at three things. One, how do we create more jobs? Two, how can we improve our transportation? And three, how do we build more housing for all Angelenos? See, people think this is the housing summit, but it's the Jobs, Housing, and Transportation Summit. And 6 years on, more than 270,000 new businesses have opened up just in the city of Los Angeles. We've cut our unemployment by more than half and created a record number of jobs for the first time since the unrest of 1992. We had more than 2.5 decades of a trough of jobs. Our economic growth is outpacing every other big city in America and America as a whole, according to Bloomberg. And on transportation, while nobody can claim that traffic's got any better in the last 6 years, through Measure M, through the embrace of the investment that we're seeing in jobs from transportation careers to our building trades, we finally said enough is enough. We put forward what will be $120 billion over the next 40 years and 787,000 jobs so that we wouldn't have to look back and have said about us what we say about previous generations. What were you thinking? Just last week, we launched the Urban Movement Labs to make LA the transportation technology capital of the world. And we can literally see light at the end of the tunnels as 15 rapid transit lines are being built. I often have conversations with people about the state of things in Los Angeles. And they say if it wasn't for our traffic and our housing crisis, LA would be perfect. Crime is at historic lows. Our trade and tourism numbers are setting records. We're finally paving our streets. We embrace our diversity. In the words of my friend and our friend Antonio Hernandez, who runs the California Community Foundation, we're still an imperfect paradise. And if everybody, imagine for a moment, had a roof over his or her head, if we could picture our children having an affordable future, that they would stay here, and maybe we could get home a little quicker, is there any other city in the world you'd want to be in? That's why in 2014, after becoming mayor, I pushed my team to think boldly before I came to speak at the first conference when I was your mayor, asking how many units did we fail to build in the last decade? And how many would we need if I was lucky enough to be elected to a second term and have 8 years to serve the city? And we came up with the biggest number in 40 years as a stretch goal and pledged to permit 100,000 units of new housing by 2021. Folks said it couldn't be done, but we have done it ahead of schedule, 2 years early this June. And look, you know it's easy to set a goal, but actually doing it, which requires public and private partnerships and changing of bureaucracies and the investment of real dollars, the men and women who build housing, it's hard to achieve. But this required, with you, looking at what I called the 4 Ps: the process for getting housing built, the planning that permits the number of units in a city, the policies that can incentivize and guide us, and the price of subsidizing housing for our low-income residents. This work has produced a record number of housing measures. Just look at what we've done together. Together, we said there should be a group at City Hall to facilitate affordable housing development, to put it at the front of the line and cut red tape. And so we created the Housing Crisis Solutions Team. We said we needed a dedicated source of funding for affordable housing, especially in the face of cuts. And we passed a linkage fee more than 40 years after my predecessor, Tom Bradley, called for it. We said, wouldn't it be great to have more housing and affordable housing near transit? So we passed transit-oriented communities. We said, how long have we talked about granny flats or ADUs? Let's actually make them easy to build. And last year, 20% of all the new housing starts in our city were ADUs. We said we needed CEQA abuse exemptions, where we're especially trying to build shelter and affordable housing. And we got that thanks to Miguel Santiago, Bob Hertzberg, and our state leaders. We said we needed the state to do more, to step up. And so I traveled with the mayors of the 13 large cities, 2 of whom are here with us today, Great Libby Schaaf and Darrell Steinberg. And we collectively said, first to Governor Brown and then to Governor Newsom, we need money and we will spend it now. And we got it. And helped the state at the same time pass a historic housing bond. I am so proud of what we have all done together to change real lives. And the list could go on, our work on earthquakes and resilience to save lives in our housing and to preserve it, the way we've worked with tenants on education, eviction protection, and statewide legislation against rent gouging. Here in LA, compared to the rest of the country, we're not just hitting goals, we're leading the pack, especially when it comes to saying yes, finally saying yes to housing where we live. After 3 decades of NIMBYism that got us no growth and slow growth and low growth, that got us here and continue to keep us here, we're turning a new page. We still want good housing. We're not going to say yes to your project, no matter what size or what design. But we figured out a way to outpace our own goals, and the numbers don't lie. Look at these for a minute. We're 40% of Los Angeles County's population in the city of LA, and we're building 75% of its housing. At the state level, the statistic's even more dramatic. The city of LA comprises just 10% of the state's population, and we've been building 20% of the state's housing. And just this summer, that number peaked, and 1 out of 4 housing starts in the state of California is coming out of a city that's just 1 out of 10 Californians. We know that affordable housing depends on 2 things: the cost of your mortgage or rent, and also your income. So we didn't ignore the income side. We raised the minimum wage and focused on key industries that don't just pay $15, but pay $50 an hour, like aerospace and entertainment, technology, green jobs. We focused on our education system, from settling the teachers' strike, which reduced classroom sizes, to making community college free, which in its first year boosted by 56% the number of LAUSD kids going full-time to community college in our city. But the truth is, we're nowhere close to where we need to be. The cost of housing, simply put, is pushing people out of our city and out of our state. It threatens to kill the California dream. Since 2013, rents in our city have gone up 25%, while incomes have only increased by 10%. 29% of this city spend 50% of their income on housing. And maybe as dramatic, nearly 6 in 10 spend more than 30% of their household income on housing. That's the level in which folks are considered at risk of becoming homeless. This year's supplemental poverty measure from the Census Bureau, if it doesn't include housing, we're 29th in our poverty rate in America. When you add housing, we're 50th. In other words, 13.3% of Californians live in poverty if you don't include housing as a measure. The moment you add the cost of housing, it goes up to nearly 1 out of 4 Californians today live in poverty because of our collective failure on housing. Rent stress is an epidemic. If you're an elected official, there's not a lot else you talk to your constituents about. Parents who are worried about putting food on the table, taking their child to a doctor. And it's not simply that we're seeing rents go up, we're not building enough housing. And I mean that in 2 ways. We're not building it in enough places. It can't just be the city of LA building it. But we're also not building it in enough places on the income spectrum either. When we set that bold goal of 100,000 units, we also pledged to build or preserve at least 15,000 units of affordable housing for low-income residents. I wish we could do more, but I was realistic in the face of the cuts that we've seen at the state and federal level. We've passed 11,000 units. In the 8 years, we will hit 15,000. But think about that for a moment. In just these 6 years, 89% of what we've built is market rate and 11% affordable in the bureaucratic definition. And maybe we need to stop thinking about a bureaucratic definition of affordable, because if you get out there in the real world, as we all do, the way we talk about at the office cooler or at Little League or with our own family members, the stress of what housing is affordable to us, we're not building anything in the middle, nothing, for the working and middle class of California. You see, in our regional needs assessment, we should have built more than 12,500 units for the lowest income Angelenos at the very bottom, but we haven't even hit 5,000. For low and moderate income, we should have had 16,000. We've barely topped 3. We need to be building housing at all levels to meet our housing needs, to address the crisis on our streets, and to make sure we're not chasing middle-class Angelenos and companies and prosperity away. And while stresses exist for the middle and working-class Angelenos, our housing crisis breaks our heart most when we see it on the streets. We saw homelessness up 16% in our city and 12% in our county last year. And I'm confident one reason we weren't up 35%, which was the average of the big counties in California, was because of the good work we're doing. It actually does work. That's an important moment to note that the city of Los Angeles, too, and cities throughout the state have relatively small roles to play in homelessness in terms of statutory authority and funding streams. But I won't let that small formal role ever silence my very loud voice on this issue. Even if it draws additional criticism and blame, we have all got to lead on this issue and demand that all levels of government do it as well. In our own budget for 6 years, I've scraped every extra penny I could find and new revenues we've created for programs the cities have never had. I've gone to voters, I've assigned new revenues, and today the homelessness budget for the city of Los Angeles is 25 times what it started as just 4 years ago, at $462 million. And the good news is, because of that and measures like HHH and H, we're housing 133 actual real people every single day, about half of them because of government intervention. Last year alone, to put that in stark relief, 21,600 people came out of homelessness. That's double what it was just 4 years ago. But the bad news is, while 133 people are coming off the streets every day, 150 people are hitting the streets each day. The statistics of our state's and our city's housing crisis aren't as powerful, though, as stories. I'll tell you one. I was with my daughter, Maya, at camp at Griffith Park. It was daddy-daughter sleepover weekend. And I met a guy who grew up in the San Fernando Valley, as I did, lives there still. He works in the entertainment industry in a blue-collar job, and he told me about his grandfather coming to the San Fernando Valley. He said, my grandpa bought his house for $5,000. And then he said, then my dad, he bought his home for $50,000. And I, working in entertainment, was able to stretch and buy a home for $500,000. And then he stopped and he looked over at his daughter, the most precious thing in the world to him, and he said, but if she only has homes for $5 million, our LA story ends. That's what's at stake today. That's what's at stake in this city and our region and our state. And to make up for decades of inaction, red tape, underfunding, California now needs, according to our own governor, 3.5 million new homes. And the state says that our region of Southern California needs 1.3 million new homes in the next 8 years. So let's go back to what I was just telling you about. In the city of LA, where we're building 2.5 times the average in the state, that would be 460,000 units in 8 years. That's up from 80,000 the last time we got that. And I started this speech by celebrating achieving 100,000 units in 6 years. Just to put in perspective, that pace would be 4 times what we're doing now, and that's 2.5 times what the state is. So that means that the average city in California needs to increase its housing construction by tenfold. So how do we get there? It can seem daunting. First, we cannot have a failure of imagination. I often say you can only do what you can imagine. So first, let's get rid of the caricature that we're either going to have Brady Bunch or Manhattan, right? The single-family neighborhood is not going to die anytime soon, but it was decades ago that we've built neighborhoods that are beautiful, livable, walkable, nice scale, from the Fairfax district to Sherman Oaks. This was in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and those places didn't fall apart, and we had the sort of density our city will need all over. We need to unleash our imaginations if we're going to save the California dream, whether that's a triplex, cutting your own house in two and adding an ADU, so the scale feels the same, but you've tripled the amount of housing you can get in there, or figuring out ways that we can make sure the middle class can buy and build wealth. Because right now, New York City has a higher home ownership rate than Los Angeles does. So let's take a moment to talk about how we can get there. Remember the 4 Ps? The first P, planning. The numbers for our Transit-Oriented Communities program speak volumes, and they demonstrate the power of planning. Since this program was launched in 2017, nearly 20,000 units have been proposed, and without any subsidies, are adding 4,000 more dedicated affordable units for low, very low, and extremely low-income Angelenos, offering more Angelenos more housing that's close to more transportation at a price that won't displace them, and it will bring folks in closer to the transportation that's near their jobs. It's that kind of thinking that will guide the update of our city's housing element in the general plan, which is the blueprint for our growth here in LA. And my first request is to ask you to join us in writing this. If you're interested in joining the Housing Element Task Force, email us. We're going to be actually holding auditions and trying to get a broad group of folks, from everyday renters to builders to nonprofit folks and government officials. The only email you need to know is housingelement@lacity.org, and send us a note. The second P, process. By continuing to streamline City Hall, we accelerate the pace of housing construction. When I became mayor, I heard you loud and clear. And so we focused on expediting approvals at the Department of Building and Safety, the Fire Department, and many other places in the entitlement process. And we've seen material improvements. But I've heard it once, I've heard 100 times, that we haven't seen enough progress in all of our departments. And I'm so proud that Marty Adams, who was with us earlier today, and I are announcing that we're going to bring that same red tape cutting focus to our Department of Water and Power, which has become one of the biggest bottlenecks in our housing production. We will restructure our development services team at DWP, and this means your project will have a single point of contact at last, from planning to electrification, cutting the time it takes to deliver electric service by at least a third. And while we look at processes as a second P, we also want to incentivize and advance good policies, the third P. AB 1197 gave us that CEQA abuse relief that will allow us to expedite the remaining 21 bridge home shelters and the nearly 150 projects, not housing units, projects that are supportive housing, including all the HHH projects. Together, those two things will be giving us 12,500 new beds for homeless Angelenos without CEQA abuse headaches. But that CEQA relief, absolutely, sorry. That's everyone in, everyone in, everyone in. Thank you, Tommy. That CEQA relief should be expanded to other types of housing and to other areas. It only applies to the city of LA. So if you're not from the city of LA, ask your legislator to attach that too, because we will only meet our state-mandated housing element and RENA targets if we expand this to other types of housing in other places. And I just recently, last weekend, spoke with the governor about this. And legislation can also help us address our low home ownership. And we're going to have to go to friends like plaintiffs' lawyers who right now aren't suing anybody for condo construction because there is no condo construction because of our liability laws. We have to change that. We cannot let New York have a higher home ownership rate than Los Angeles, and we cannot let the middle class only think about a lifetime of paying rent instead of paying a mortgage. And as the state comes back to look at SB 50, instead of a one-size-fits-all solution, look closely at our transit-oriented communities. We think this is the skeleton for a statewide program that balances housing needs with community plans while reaching our housing goals. And finally, we need state action to put a measure on the ballot to deliver the Prop 63 dollars that Darrell Steinberg authored, got passed, and people like Mark Ridley Thomas are hungering to spend more easily on mental health and on housing today. Which brings me to the fourth and final P, price. It must also be this year for all of us a priority to push the state to not only renew what's called the HAP dollars, these were the emergency homelessness dollars, but to have a decade-long commitment to them. We are stepping up with 2 decade-long commitments in Los Angeles. We want the state of California to do the same. In our local communities, we know how to spend that quickly. For Libby in Oakland, for Darrell in Sacramento, for me, it's weeks after we get the check, we're putting that on the ground with services and shelter and housing. And this week, thanks to all of our hard work, the state announced another projected budget surplus, so the timing is perfect. There's room of several $billion in investment in ongoing programs, even in the event of an economic downturn. So I'm calling on our state for a multi-year commitment. Second, I'm calling on the state to get tax increment financing back for housing. This year, we thought we had it. SB 5 passed both houses. It would have restored a decade of cuts, but it was unfortunately vetoed. And sometimes people ask me, where does this housing and homelessness crisis come from? And it's complicated and it comes from many places. But I always point to the cuts from the federal government and the end of redevelopment in our state. Let me calculate that to make it real for you here in LA. Those cuts together have decreased our affordable housing dollars by $500 million annually since 2008, which conservatively translates into a loss of 20,000 affordable units across LA County in this last decade. Imagine if we had built 20,000 more units, how many fewer people would be on our streets today. The state needs to step up. We want the governor and the legislature to work together and sign that so we get tax increment financing back. The good news is things are changing. Popular opinion backs these policies. The legislature is working hard, and we have a governor who understands housing and understands homelessness. Thousands of units are being built. Historic measures are being passed. And I told you about those 4 Ps, but I'll just do a quick thing to not lose sight of 2 others, which is preservation and protection. Because if our funding streams from the state and other places don't preserve what we have, we can build new units, but we'll just be treading water in terms of our net gain if we lose. And if we don't protect people through legal counsel and anti-rent gouging measures like AB 1482, we're all going to pay the price regardless of your ideology. And I strongly support a right to housing, locally, statewide, and nationally. You know, in this country, if all of us were so poor, thank you for, my mayor is right there, Darrell Steinberg. In this country, think about this for a second. If we all qualify for food stamps, we get it so that our children can eat. If all of us qualify for Medicaid, we get it so that we won't be sick. But if you and I qualify for a Section 8 voucher or another housing subsidy, in this country there's a 1 in 4 chance, in this city a 1 in 8 chance that you will get it. So I love that our president's talking about homelessness. I know some of you might not feel the same way, but welcome to the fight. And together with our Congress, imagine if that was 8 out of 8. We would not have homelessness in this city and in this country. If you want to end homelessness, let's start that conversation right there. The challenge we face is immense, and to the faint of heart, it might seem impossible, but I see hopeful signs everywhere, every day. I saw it 2 weeks ago at the Southern California Association of Government vote, where we rallied elected officials across 6 counties to reject a flawed methodology that tried to push housing further and further away, longer commutes, away from jobs. A reminder that the status quo doesn't serve us, and the vote wasn't even close, 43-19. I see hope in communities where young people are turning out to meetings, not paid for by a developer, not ginned up by City Hall, saying, I want to stay in California. I want to stay in this city, and I still believe in the California dream. And I want to upzone, I want you to build more, I want you to locate affordable housing and shelter right where I live. And I see hope in federal legislation that our representatives, from Maxine Waters to Ted Lieu and Dianne Feinstein, have introduced to have a national strategy to combat our homelessness crisis. $14 billion between the 2 pieces of legislation that they have introduced. So while national leaders beat up LA and California, I remind them there are more homeless people per capita right in the shadow of Congress and the White House in Washington, D.C. than here in LA. We have our work cut out for us, but this is a fight worth fighting. The way forward has never been more clear, and in the face of these challenges, I stand before you, energized, optimistic, and undeterred to restore that California dream I felt growing up. You see, the California dream endures from generation to generation, but how it manifests changes. But through it all, one thing that doesn't change, this is the state that should be a place of opportunity and belonging for everyone. And that's something I fight for every day, and I want to make sure you are fighting for every single day. So my challenge is to stick with us as we do this together, to be fearless in guiding the future. Don't be afraid of the future. Don't be future phobic. Don't be passive about the future. Don't be future passive. Be future guiding. Guide a future where no one is locked out of opportunity, where no one sleeps on the street, where no one is worried about how they will pay for their housing. Because if we guide and shape that future, the generations that will come will continue to be blessed by the very thing that has led us here today, and that is the California dream. Thank you.
Please now welcome today's final panel, Statewide Solutions for Housing and Homelessness, with moderator Bill Whitty, Chairman and CEO of Related California.
So I think our panel literally and figuratively needs no introduction. In addition to Eric, we have LA County Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas, Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf, Sacramento Mayor Darrell Steinberg. I've gotten to know and work with each of them over the years, among the most thoughtful people in the state. They may have different views. This is a very complicated issue. And in case we needed any reminder of the magnitude of the problem, I mean, Eric, just when you thought it was safe to get out of bed this morning, the New York Times comes out with yet another article. They're always reminding us of how California has so many problems about the affordability crisis in LA. So I'm the only one on this panel so far who has not had the press inquire of me why I'm not doing more. But I do have some perspective on this. We are currently working with the Weingart Center on a major homeless development project in Skid Row, on a community of friends. I saw Dora Gallo here earlier on a project in Santa Ana. Both are homeless, and we're active all over the state. So we see the problem, we hear all the issues. What can be done about it? You've heard the data, you know all the data. Mark has made a point of the deaths on the street. Eric talked about the data, more money, but still more homeless. So just in the short run, I want to start with Mark and Darrell, who've been involved at the state level on this issue. What can be done immediately? Talk a little bit about, the emergency declaration on homeless, the right to housing. What can the state do? Is it just the bully pulpit? Is it more?
Well, I don't think that it's just the bully pulpit. I believe that the governor has made it clear that we own this issue, and there is no getting away from that. He's appointed Mayor Steinberg, an article chair, his Council on Homelessness. He's appointed Mayor Schaaf to be one of the members of it, and we're hard at work. I frankly believe that urgency is what we need to be governed by. I do not believe that a bureaucratic response will get this done. I think we need to move beyond the rhetoric of thinking outside of the box and acting like we have a crisis of consequence that confronts us, not only in Los Angeles, but across the state for sure. And I have said, and I will say it again, it is not only urgent, but it requires an urgent response. Some think that the notion of the declaration of a state of emergency is not warranted. I simply beg to differ. If you don't want to call it a state of emergency, call it a comprehensive crisis response plan. Call it what you will. Use whatever euphemisms there may be that suit you. But we have to move with the kind of force that speaks to the following: the appropriate levels of regulatory relief, an uptick in significant ways to deal with this on a short-term basis rather than more long-term strategies that we didn't think were long-term when we started just 3 years ago. And I believe that the governor's already done some of those things. There are more things to do that we have submitted for his consideration, and we will keep pressing that case. I simply want to say no more business as usual. This is a crisis that's getting worse every day, and if we don't step to it with the kind of force, imagination, and capacity, we will not earn our titles as being honorable.
So, Darrell, you've spoken about a right to shelter, which is consistent certainly with an emergency. Since this is not a problem just of the major cities, it's much broader than that. We've seen it in Orange County and elsewhere. What if you're in a city that doesn't locally have resources and there's a right to shelter? What do you do to implement the right to shelter?
Well, allow me, if I might, just to take my opening here to step out and explain what I mean by this concept, because we have definitely stoked a hearty conversation, maybe a controversy, and I want to explain it, and in so doing, to answer your question. First of all, let me stipulate this problem is complicated. And yes, we must spend equal time on prevention and early intervention. But I think we have so complicated the issues of chronic homelessness that we have failed to step back and admit to some basic truths. And I want to put out this challenge, which is really what the question is all about. We know what works. Mayor Garcetti talked eloquently about it a few moments ago, about all the people off the streets. We know about full-service partnership, wraparound services. We know about rapid rehousing. We know how to do housing construction. All of it, we know how to do it. And yes, money is an issue, and bureaucratic slowness is an issue. But ask this question: why haven't our fragmented systems in California elevated best practices to scale? And I think there is not a singular answer, but a lead answer. And what I put out to you today is the main reason is that there is not a direction which requires us to align resources, to consolidate efforts, and to meet a legal imperative. So when we talk, and it was originally a right to shelter in the Los Angeles Times, and I heard a lot of critique, and I, as a good public official, I hope, took in that constructive critique and realized that shelter itself is pejorative, and that the New York right to shelter is imperfect because it did not include intensive services, case management, and permanent housing, and yet the right they state, nonetheless, is very powerful. Mm-hmm. Because 95% of New York's homeless population, New York City's, is actually under a roof. So what Mark Ridley Thomas and I talk about, sometimes in different ways, but it's the same concept, is really a legally enforceable right to housing. Because until we require what we know is necessary for public health, public safety, and the dignity of people, and if we continue to do good faith efforts, but everything from the bottom up, we're going to help a lot of people along the way, but we are not going to be driven towards the first imperative, which is to bring people indoors so they can get the help they need. And by the way, permanent housing first, navigation centers and shelters as necessary. Finally, what do I mean by this right, and how would you enforce and implement it, to get to your question? I believe we need a state constitutional amendment or a state statute which says there is a legally enforceable right for people to have a roof over their heads. I would, by the way, amend it to use any vernacular that is better than that, including a right to housing. How would I enforce it? We enforce it through a public right of action. You know what's happened in Orange County? Your neighbors next door? They actually have every one of these systems working collaboratively. They're merging resources. They're establishing 3 key hubs under the Be Well Orange County mantle. And you know why they're doing it, in large part? One, is the right thing to do, but two, a federal judge, David Carter, told them they had to. Why is that so surprising? Look at every other key public policy area in our state. I'll just cite you 2, and then I'm going to cede the floor. Sorry. In 1976, when we passed the Lanterman-Petra, 1967 passed the Lanterman-Petra-Short Act in California and shut the state mental hospitals, we did not give the mentally ill any kind of entitlement to housing or services. 10 years later, when the same Frank Lanterman passed the law deinstitutionalizing the developmentally disabled in state hospitals, we provided them with an entitlement. And what's the difference? Maybe oversimplified. You don't see 20-somethings with autism or developmental disabilities living under freeway overpasses, because we've required that we take care of a vulnerable population. Why is everything voluntary for this most vulnerable population? I think we enforce it through a public right of action. Court oversight is necessary, but the requirement of the legal imperative must be for state and local government to consolidate resources, to merge strategy and effort, and to drive towards the only North Star that matters, and that is to bring people inside so that they can reclaim their lives.
So, Libby, I want to ask you a question in a second, because you have some other approaches you're trying. But I would say to everybody in this room, I would refer to something Jason Elliott mentioned about this court case in San Mateo County, which explicitly said at a lower court level that the state has no right to enforce housing mandates. That needs to be overturned for a whole range of reasons, things Eric spoke about earlier. But Libby, we've been talking a lot about what government can do, and in the immediate term, you have some initiatives that also involve the private sector.
I agree with this sense of urgency. And let's all be honest, government is not the best risk taker. And we don't always move very quickly. And so I want to express deep appreciation to my Chamber of Commerce in Oakland. In fact, the CEO, Barb Leslie, is here. And just say that sometimes in order to move quickly and take risks, we kind of have to do it on the edges of government. And so because I came up with what was kind of a crazy idea, people thought it was crazy, and I could not get political support for it. But my business community was willing to take the risk with me. And so actually, if you could throw up a slide, this is something we've done in Oakland called cabin communities that have been a very rapid, very effective way of immediately sheltering and healing people. And Bill, I hope you're going to ask me about why I think shelter is not the only thing, but it is the immediate crisis we have. What has been an amazing lesson in doing these is one, dignified shelter has to have the 4 Ps. And that is, people need to be able to sleep at night with their pets, their partners, their possessions, not only sleep with them securely at night, but be able to leave them safely somewhere during the day so they can go out and seek income. And fourth, and importantly, privacy. Do you see this man holding his key? The fact that he got to go to bed at night behind a locked door, even though it was in a simple little cabin like this. The fact that when he closed that door, the sound of the freeway that he had been living with for years in his head went away, and he could have his first good night of sleep in years. That is part of the healing and the dignity that the traditional shelter, which is a big room like this full of cots, does not offer. And so we should not be surprised when, particularly in good climate places like California, we actually have people choosing to sleep under the freeways than accept traditional shelter. Mm-hmm. The other thing that has been exciting about these, we can put them up within 3 months. And I have put up 16 different homelessness interventions in my city without any community opposition. Now, how did I get that done? One, these feel pretty temporary and they actually can be moved. Two, we actually locate them where encampments already are, where the housed community is already super frustrated with the impact of the unsheltered population in their neighborhood. And what we say to them is, we are going to stand up this cabin community, 20 little cabins with full-time security and services on site. And we are then going to invite the unsheltered people that are already in this neighborhood, that have already created bonds of community, to move as a whole community into the cabin community. So unlike the way traditionally counties, I call it tweezer government, pick out the most medically vulnerable to send to shelter, we actually allow an entire encampment community to move as a whole. We then create a boundary physically around the area where this cabin community is. We call that the invitation zone. We work over around a 6-week period to very gently encourage people to voluntarily accept this shelter. And the acceptance rate is higher than any other intervention I know. It is between 85% and 90%, where in other communities, often people will move rather than accept the shelter. And then finally, the outcomes have been phenomenal. 65% have mostly gone from this healing place to a permanent housing situation. Of that 65, about 15% have moved to more supportive transitional housing. Those are phenomenal outcome numbers. And this costs half of what a San Francisco-style navigation center costs. Half the cost, better outcomes. The other thing I'll throw in there is we've also started doing safe RV parks. 45% of our unsheltered residents in Oakland are living in their cars or their RVs. And we've set up very simple, safe places for these people to park, with porta potties, with drinkable water, with electricity plug-ins, and a security guard at night. No services, just those basic supports. That cost me $4,000 per person per year. And it is definitely healing our situation.
So I want to get into the weeds a little more in some of these programs. But first, two political questions. I mean, Eric, you talked about your Bridges program, which is citywide. I watched from afar as you and Mike Bonin went to Venice and got screamed at by residents. Is it politically realistic to deal with the homeless population that is now living throughout the city by building shelters, permanent or otherwise, throughout the city? Is that politically deliverable?
Absolutely, and it's one of the sad parts of coverage of this. And I meant what I said up there with my optimism. You probably saw, if you live in LA, that town hall and a couple protests in Koreatown. By the way, the thing in Venice is still being built. And Koreatown, a negotiation moved it a few blocks to the east, and that place where it was going to be a shelter is now going to be permanent supportive housing, so we got double the solutions out of it. That didn't make the screaming headlines. Solution solved, homeless shelter coming. And by the way, of the 29 that we have, because you have to, as Libby was just saying, really start where people live. You're more likely to be from Los Angeles if you're unhoused than if you're housed. And the overwhelming majority of people who are homeless in a neighborhood have a connection to that neighborhood, either because they grew up there or lived there just before they were homeless. So you actually have to solve it in the community they know. When people are like, people always come up to us with great solutions. Like my favorite is always the old cruise ships that we're just going to put out off the coast, and people put homeless folks in the cruise ships. Or in LA County, it's usually Palmdale or Lancaster. And I checked with both mayors, and they don't want all of LA County's homeless population. You have to actually treat people where they are. And the other 29 that we will have done by June 30th, the most of any city in the nation will be about 2,000 plus beds worth. 27 of those. And by the way, council members are always portrayed as like not wanting it. Every council member, every district has them except one or two right now. And it's not for lack of wanting it, it's looking for the real estate. So we actually have over 75%, as United Way shows us in polls, of people saying yes. 100% of my council saying yes. And I don't know, 95% of the meetings that we have, we're getting to yes. But that 5% makes some pretty sexy TV.
So you read about it, it's in LA, it's in Oakland and Sacramento, but I think most of you would agree, Darrell alluded to it, it's a regional problem. The most tangible evidence of that, certainly that I've seen, is what Mark and Eric were able to do with their complementary bond issues, with the City of LA's $1.2 billion for capital costs, the County of LA's $350 million for operating costs, both of which you need. So Mark, talk a little bit about how that just, in the City of LA and the County of LA, I think most of you know, we're not always the best of friends. So to have that happen is pretty significant.
Come out of a lawsuit?
And
way back, yeah.
And then I would open it up to other questions about regional. This is true whether you're talking about the overall housing problem, the homeless problem, whatever. So Mark, talk a little bit about how you got there and other thoughts you might have. You have a huge district to begin with.
I think it's true to say that this is we might characterize it as a high point in city-county collaboration. When we studied our respective realities in 2015 and 2016 and came up with the respective recommendations that the city and the county would seek to implement, we coordinated and we issued those on precisely the same day as communicating that we would be in alignment and working together. Bill, the thing that is troubling to me is the following. We would not have predicted, after the successes that we experienced with Proposition HHH and Measure H, that conditions objectively would be worse today than they were then. That's where we missed the mark, and that's no blame to be placed anywhere. Anyone who is willing to say that they knew that this would happen, I want to see them by the flagpole.
We're taking a trip to Vegas.
And we're going to have a good conversation. And so the fact of the matter is this. The people of this region do not think that Triple H and or H are doing what they were intended to do. They have made that abundantly clear in poll after poll, focus group after focus group. And so rather than focusing on what we think that we've accomplished, which in many respects has been more than ever, and we're making up for lost time, it seems to me that we needn't pat ourselves on the back too rigorously, but come to grips with the fact that we have a crisis far more substantial than we had anticipated, and we need to roll up our sleeves anew, break out of our traditional ways of doing business, go to work, carve out public-private partnerships, appeal to the infrastructure of the public sector, appeal to the innovation of the private sector, and get work done in an unprecedented way. Nothing else will satisfy our respective constituencies, communities, and the like. That's our challenge. That's our mandate. We have to do that. I can tell you all day and all night what we have done. But I can tell you this, it is simply insufficient. And we've got to figure out how to work beyond this. Now, some say, well, don't open the checkbook too widely. Well, let me just say this to you. Homelessness costs more than the preventive efforts we would have to correct it. It is costly. It is fiscally imprudent. Therefore, we have an obligation to embrace some comprehensive crisis response strategy. We have an obligation to get to this business of a right to shelter. We have an obligation to deal with bridge home options, and communities such as Mayor Schaaf has articulated. And I don't subscribe to one size fits all. We need to be prescriptive up to a point, but we need to be imaginative, flexible, and open in such a way that we cannot allow the current conditions that have enveloped our communities to stand. It is our responsibility to address it with imagination, and I believe where there's a will, there's a way.
So, Darrell, you're the mayor now, so you're in the hot seat. You've been president pro tem of the Senate and the legislature. You've been a council person, but you also know that Sacramento doesn't always, writ large, doesn't always work as efficiently as it might.
The city or the state?
The state. Well, the state, for example.
Because the city is damn efficient.
That's right.
Yeah.
There you go. But Darrell, you know this. For example, at the state level, not true in most states, housing programs are run by 4 separate agencies, 2 by the governor, 2 by the treasurer. Sometimes they talk, sometimes they don't. So the governor has proposed more housing things than I've ever seen from any governor. It's great, but we still have these 4 agencies, 2 of which don't have directors now. So how do we implement what Mark just said?
So I want to
be careful.
I'm going to be careful. I actually want to pick up on Libby Schaaf's presentation about the tough sheds. How impressive!
We don't call them tough sheds.
Sorry, whatever they are, cabin communities.
We don't use that product anymore.
Like you heard earlier, I'm still working on terminology. Okay?
Good try, Darrell.
Good try. But I want to answer the question by making this point. In California, we do not have a failure of individual leadership. In fact, we have leadership aplenty. I think is demonstrated by my 3 colleagues here. We have a systems failure. Because when I look at the cabin communities, and I look at that, I have a different question than maybe everyone look and say, well, how great that is. I'm asking myself, why isn't the county of Alameda, the state of California, rallying to galvanize the resources to make sure that that model is doubled, tripled, quadrupled to the scale that is necessary to address the problem in the Bay Area? Why not? And I submit to you again, and I don't care if I'm a bit of a broken record here, that state government's primary role is to send market signals and to tell us as a society what it is it expects us to accomplish. And the state is not doing that. Yes, there are 4 different housing programs. And yes, Governor Newsom is the best hope we have here, by the way, because he actually cares about these sets of issues.
Right.
But as far as policy is concerned, we are not there yet, because we have not said that it is no longer okay as a matter of public policy for people to live outdoors. Imagine if we said that, and if it were enforceable with all the details to be worked out, you better believe that the county of Alameda would be working with this leader here, the mayor of Oakland, in more robust ways with the state of California to take the best models and to elevate them in ways that would actually address the volume here. Why don't we get this, everybody? You cannot continue a bottoms-up, great pilot approach, 4 different state agencies dealing with housing, and expect that systems are going to change on their own. They're only going to change. They are only going to change if we tell them that they must change. And how do you tell them that they must change? You place into law an enforceable requirement to accomplish the end that we all seek. Let me give you one other example of where the state policy is really far off. Affordable housing is the answer. Of course, it isn't shelter. I agree with Libby. But it costs $500,000 to $700,000 of public subsidy per unit to build a single unit of affordable housing. Where is the market signal and the incentive to build more of the kind of efficiency housing that Mayor Garcetti and Mayor Schaaf have talked about and have championed? Why do we subsidize one prototype? Why don't all the state agencies actually get together and say, you know what, we're going to put 30, 50% of our housing dollar into this kind of effectiveness and efficiency that can be built faster and at much less cost. Instead, we've got to live with the Bay Area Council business report that says, with the current housing prototype we use, which is quality, by the way, it's going to take until 2037 to get the last homeless person off the streets in the Bay Area. Come on.
So let me ask first Libby and then Eric on that note. And a developer, I'm well familiar with how things end up costing $700,000 a unit. If we build market rate as well as affordable housing, with affordable housing, and these are all noble objectives, you are asked to meet multiple public policy objectives. Some of them add cost. They're all good. But Darrell, to your point, if this is in fact a crisis, what things can be done that would relax cost? And you kind of have to get specific here because otherwise we're talking only at this level. The second question I would have to Libby and Eric is, if I went to Oakland or LA, and I think I know the answer, but who would you direct me to? If I said, I have an idea to, and I know, Eric, you've got some prototypes, things, Libby just described some. Who should I talk to who can implement your vision with full authority? So 2 questions.
And I'm going to be a politician and answer the question I want to answer. I will get to yours in a second.
Well, you are a politician.
I want to really emphasize what concerns me about right to shelter that concerns me less about right to housing.
Good, because I'm for right to housing.
Good. I'm glad we've gotten there. Right to shelter is kind of about hiding the problem. Right to housing is about solving it.
Fine.
Okay? New York's right to shelter has been a failure. New York actually has the highest per capita homeless in the country. They're sheltered. They're out of your eyesight, but they are homeless. It has not worked. The thing that concerns me about right to housing, which I can support, because again, in a system that works, we prevent people from becoming homeless. We have an adequate supply and maintain an adequate supply of housing that is affordable to everyone, to the full range of people and vulnerable families and workers that we have in our beautiful state. And if we did those 2 things, we wouldn't need a shelter system. Our goal is to actually eliminate the shelter system, all right? Does that make sense? If we're doing our jobs. So that's what worries me about this focus on shelter. We're in a crisis. We got to do it now, but let's not keep our eyes off the prize.
Mark, on that note.
Just a point of intervention.
Okay.
We realize that New York is not the panacea. After all, this is Los Angeles. And to the extent that that is the case, I just simply want to say the following. We have a similar number of people who are homeless in New York, as is the case in Los Angeles. But the defining difference in many respects, Mayor Schaaf, is that the number of people who die on the streets of Los Angeles is 3 times of that in New York. And the experts attribute that to one thing: shelter. Now, I am not seeking to elevate the issue of the state of shelters in New York. I believe California could do it much better. If we don't, shame on us. But I do want to insist to have nearly 1,000 people die on the streets of Los Angeles attributable to homelessness, according to our coroner and chief medical examiner, is beneath us. It is just simply morally repugnant, and we should not. Now, let me just tell you, good public policy anticipates outcomes and consequences, and we can predict allowing people manufacturing court decisions and the like that only cause government to cop out and not do what we need to do, which is to step up and build a range of options in terms of housing, permanent, supportive housing, shelter, call it what you will. Get people indoors. That's the only thing that honors their dignity as human beings. That's what we ought to be.
And when we declare rights, we're giving beautiful speeches, but we actually have to also do the hard work of figuring out the specific policy changes and specific funding changes that can actually effectuate the intention behind the beautiful speech.
Agreed.
We do.
It's not simply a
Let
beautiful
me. I
speech.
want to get in on that, please. Can I?
Well, I was going to actually answer your question.
Can I get in on that? Because this is a key. This is a key debating point. I feel like I'm on the Democratic stage in Atlanta here. Please.
Look, I wrote the damn bill. I wrote the damn bill.
Okay, Daryl. Daryl, I think we can all agree that
No,
this
but I
is
want
a
to answer
very complicated issue.
because
There's nothing he said I disagree
no,
with.
but we are
Nothing
not
you said I
far
disagree with.
apart here. But
we are
I
in
want to.
agreement.
There's a point I just
Everything
need.
I said was and.
You're good.
And.
It's all good. Yes, we need to change the funding streams and the systems, but there's a subtler point that I just have to reemphasize. The only way we collectively are going to do that, because we've known what we've had to do for decades, the only way we're going to do that is if the state government sets the public policy that requires us to do it. That's the only point.
Okay,
That's the only
so
point of
I'm not in disagreement with that as long as we also do that.
Eric,
Do you want me to answer the question about the housing?
No, but that's okay.
I'll get to your question.
So Eric, the city of LA, in the eye of the storm, has been taken to task over, Mark alluded to it. Spent all this money, or voters approved all this money, what do you got to show for it? And I know there's a lot been going on behind the scenes. Talk a little bit about, from a cost, a bureaucratic efficiency perspective, what you're doing, and maybe equally importantly, what you'd still like to do that hasn't been done yet.
So let me resolve this conflict really quick, because I do think that they agree, which is a right to housing, which expands our permanent housing dollars and our shelter dollars, not at a zero-sum game, but ups both of them, with a shelter model that isn't New York's, that comes with services and outcomes, and a disruptive approach to how we build everything from the shelters. We had fires, and in 2 days we can get hundreds of our firefighters sleeping, bathing, brushing their teeth, and eating. So we can do this, I think, a little faster than we are. We'll resolve, and I think nobody up here would be against that. The idea that it's not being done, by the way, I think we do have to push back, not as a way of patting ourselves on the back, but because when you pass something that's 10 years, housing especially takes about 3 to get through, find the piece of land, get it entitled, go through that, even as we've shortened that, thanks to the state and our local efforts. And the H stuff, together with HHH, and by the way, HHH wouldn't have passed without this guy, and H wouldn't have passed if the city of LA and our leaders hadn't campaigned for it. So we're tied together. That H stuff
has helped us together with HHH go from 9,000 to 21,000 real people. Like, let's not lose sight of 12,000 additional people whose lives are changed from government intervention. When I hear the model's not working, that's bullshit. The model works, we don't have enough money for it. So that's when you could say the federal government, don't let them off the hook. And don't let the state cuts just be something that we take for granted because they were 11 years ago, and this is the new normal. It's the new abnormal. So let's get back to then, what do we need to do? Well, the disruption, we're doing it. HHH, we put out $120 million, $120 million of that to build, or $100 million to build 1,200 units using all sorts of new things, smaller units, prefab. We're working with our labor partners, carpenters I see here, who are volunteering labor to come in here. You have to ask yourself a couple fundamental questions. One, are you willing to pay for it? Voters have said that twice, but now we have to demand, you know where those $21 billion of a surplus went? Mostly into a rainy day fund. Ask any Californian what the #1 issue is. It's homelessness, and it's pouring. So why are we socking that money away right now? When what I was talking about, the California dream is endangered. People aren't going to come here. They're not going to invest here. They're not going to have, I mean, this is the business council. Let's have a business argument right now for solving and spending money now so that it doesn't become a liability long term. And let's figure out, secondly, not what are you willing to give up? As labor did, we'll volunteer some labor. Like, that's not prevailing wage, right? It's actually, we want to be part of the solution. It's folks who have land. How many landlords? In Pacific Palisades, at a micro level, everybody learned who the homeless folks were, and then don't just wait for the agencies to find an apartment. They talk to each other. Who knows somebody who has an apartment? And you could double or triple the capacity so our Section 8 vouchers don't expire. And if you think this isn't a solvable problem, I would just say, look at what we've done with veterans. When the federal government did step up with Barack Obama and Donald Trump's administrations, with VASH vouchers, SSVS vouchers, et cetera, aligned services, they have land, which this administration is starting to discover, and we like that. And we came together. We reduced veterans' homelessness by 80% in this city. I'm a veteran. We're no different than non-veterans. We're just as diverse. I know you were going to ask about African-American homelessness. We're African-American, Latino, we're women, we're men, we're young, we're old, we have disability, we don't, we have addiction problems, some of us a certain time don't. We can solve homelessness. That's actually the answer. So it's not that the model's not right. It's the sense of urgency at all levels and the funding. Let us not lose sight of that.
So,
yeah, well,
on the fund,
I
go ahead,
need to
Mark.
call the governor right now to make sure that he knows that it wasn't me who taking all these temperate.
Put him on speaker.
Well,
yeah, put him on.
let's talk.
Gavin,
Let's talk a little.
That wasn't me. That wasn't me.
Little more specifically.
I mean the feds, as well as that $21 billion.
So, Eric, let's talk about funding. One of the challenges in affordable housing now, and I'm going to get a little granular on you, is there is state bond measures, there's local bond measures. People have been pretty responsive at the local level, like I've never seen before. Yep. We know from recent polling at the state that the tax-exempt bonding authority, which is necessary to access low-income housing tax credits, which fund most of these projects, there's $7 billion of demand, and depending on what the treasurer ultimately approves, $3 to $4 billion of authority. That's all for, well, almost all for affordable housing. There's homeless housing, there's conventional affordable housing. How do we reconcile differences? I will give you one hint, however. There is, as you know, a permanent source, not that robust at the state level. The realtors fought it for years that got through for affordable housing. Right. Permanent source, fees on transfers.
Right.
Maybe that's a direction, but I'm trying to get to, can we, because it's such a right, can we separate funding for homeless from funding for affordable housing? Just a question.
Well, I think we have to deal with the urgency of the hour and what voters are saying. I mean, the poll that we most recently read from the LA Business Council and the LA Times was striking. And there's just no way to get away from the sense in which they have an expectation that we will move with all our might, our resources, our compassion, and our capacity to lift people from this environment of homelessness, these unspeakable conditions to which people are being subjected. Now, Bill, I think we can get into funding formulas and the distribution of resources from the 4 state agencies, the agencies in the cities, the agencies in the county. But if those agencies are not intensely collaborative vis-a-vis the issue of making sure that people are indoors, off these streets, into shelters, into permanent supportive housing, into bridge housing, name the housing, it is simply sounding brass and tinkling cymbals. We've got to make a statement that we honor people's dignity and worth, and they do not belong on the streets, cold, wet, hard, being subjected to acts of violence. That's the mandate. And so the funding and all that, you know what? That can be figured out.
Yeah,
Eric says he has $21 billion in his pocket. It can be figured out.
I want to talk about money for a moment, because, you know, I'm proud of the fact that I led on the millionaire's tax right before its time, and I will stipulate here, absolutely, we need more money, but I want to be a bit of a contrarian in this sense. Until we do better at focusing more strategically the money we have on the imperative to first bring people indoors to permanent housing, it's going to be, at best, a very tough sell in Sacramento and maybe even with the voters. You look at the polling, for example, on the education bond now. It's not nearly as high as it could or it should be. And so we want more money. I think we first have to show that the money we have is being more focused on the end. And I will put on the table my own, and Mayor Garcetti mentioned it in his speech, the Mental Health Services Act, Proposition 63, which I think has been, no pride of authorship aside, a great success. I think it has helped. No, but I'm going to be critical here in a minute. I think it has helped tens of thousands of people. I know it has.
Who authored that, Daryl?
Well, I did, of course. Well, however, wait, I'm going to get to the last point, which is that I also believe that it should be refreshed to be more focused on its original intent, which is unsheltered homelessness, because not enough of the money is being spent on unsheltered homelessness. It's helping a lot of people who are sick, but not the sickest of the sick.
Yeah.
And that's the same with all of our initiatives here. We've got to answer that question about effective spending of what we have before we go after more resources.
So we only have a few minutes left, Libby, and then I have one question that I do want to ask.
Okay, 3 things about the money. One, you guys have been incredible leaders in hustling up local dollars, but that's because of all the cuts that have happened. So let's just know that since the mid-1970s, HUD, our federal government, has had their spending authority for housing supports cut by 70%. The federal government has cut housing supports by 70%. We need to hold them accountable, and it should not be a partisan issue. Secondly, all the special bond issues that we've done locally still don't make up for the elimination of redevelopment in California.
Certainly true.
And then third, and you'll like this one, Bill, we have to recognize that the undersupply of housing is a cost issue. Because when you have income inequality and a shortage of housing, the remaining housing goes to the highest bidder. And so we've got to recognize that fixing the supply problem is part of the affordability issue. And it's not only, we can't only build our way out of the problem, we have to change regulations to make it easier to have shared housing models, to preserve our SROs and our boarding houses. We have to invest more in preventing people, and this is not always comfortable. We've got to strengthen tenant protections. We've got to help people from losing the housing they have and really invest in the prevention of people becoming homeless. Can I just say, we've done something in Oakland, Keep Oakland Housed. Our first year, we kept 1,800 families from falling into homelessness, and the average cost was about $3,000 per household. That is a lot cheaper than a new unit or an emergency window.
So the whole tenant protection issue is a huge one. It's of statewide interest, et cetera.
Yeah.
We don't have time to get into it today, but on the protection and prevention notion, let me ask you, I'm very active in San Francisco as well. In San Francisco and LA, the percentage of the homeless population that is African American is 4 or 5 times greater than that population in that city. Any of you comment on that? And now I'm not just talking about shelter, but about how do we prevent that? How do we address the underlying issues that have led to that result?
Well, you'd have to unwind the history of racism in America. I mean, it's just... Jacqueline Wagner, who is a commissioner on LASA, chaired the first study of African Americans experiencing homelessness in this region, and it was one of the first anywhere in the nation, as I recall. It was unsettling to be reminded of the contributing factors that relegate people to a certain status. Now, California, 6-7% African American, 40% homeless population. The same mirrors in Los Angeles region, although there are approximately 9% African Americans in this region. 39% of the homeless population happens to be African American. But homelessness doesn't have to be reduced to a matter of race alone, but we cannot ignore it. LASA did a report on women. They did a report on Native Americans, all of which need to be studied with care. So there's a particularity to homelessness in these various demographics. But I simply want to say that the longstanding issues related to race in terms of education, healthcare disparities in the area of employment, in the area of housing, all of these are contributing factors of consequence, not just yesterday, but today. It's quite obvious, it's quite clear, and we must be resolved in our stand-up against the pushback against the vestiges and the historical impacts of racial injustice in our land.
And out of that report that Jacqueline and the commission had, it was concrete suggestions about what to do. So again, those state dollars, which I wish were in my pocket, but the state dollars, which we did get, and thanks to Gavin Newsom, increased by 50%, but we're still a third of what we asked for, to be clear, which was $2 billion. We were able to put that on the ground, and we just announced that in Skid Row, because if you want to understand African American homelessness, go to Skid Row. It is the embodiment of it, it is the concentration of it, it is the distillation of decades in this country of racism and other things. There we have race-conscious policies to focus on African American and women Angelenos who are experiencing homelessness by building in those places and by housing in those places first. If we don't have that as part of the lens of what we do in homelessness too, because a veteran is going through oftentimes a different thing, a youth who is emancipating out of foster care. If we don't have that focus, we will not have the programs that actually do something about it. So the analysis is the first step, but we have to have race-conscious policies, gender-conscious policies, and person-conscious policies as well.
So I think you can see that if all the elected officials were like this, we would probably be further along in addressing the homeless problem. I am told, though, that we are sort of exceeded our time. I want to be respectful of everybody's schedule. Please join me in thanking this panel for
Thank you all for joining this year's summit. We'll see you next year.